I hear the clock ticking in the background.
Mm-hmm. Is that a problem? We can switch it off.
Maybe it's good to switch it off so it doesn't distract.
All right.
Otherwise, it kind of feels like you only have 2 minutes left.
Okay, no problem. It was supposed to help me control my own time claim.
Oh, okay. I will take over that task for you, and I will.
All right, Peter.
And we'll probably take a few more extra minutes in the beginning to discuss who we are. I think 5 minutes for all is maybe a little bit short, but it will be okay. And then we will start the presentation. Is it okay with everyone?
Yeah.
We'll first give a small introduction. Then I will introduce you guys shortly and let you explain a little bit by yourself who you are. And then I will introduce myself, and then we can start with the presentation of Hans and Rida.
Sounds good.
Excellent. I'll get myself some more water. There are already 4 people watching the live stream preparation, so that's already something. Okay. One more minute. I think we started.
Please start, Peter.
Hello, welcome to the 6th Youth-led Climate Partnership webinar series. This is the last series of this webinar thing, and it's jointly organized by TYQ Research and Action Consulting and the Energy Academy of Indonesia. I'm Peter Ackerman, your host for today, and this evening we will discuss climate economics and development. As you all know, the current climate crisis has economic, political, social, and technological dimensions. It's an area that embodies public goods, common property, renewables, externalities, and many more aspects. Economic theory cannot adequately deal with the climate crisis as the problem has such a broad scope. However, economic analysis and policy might offer ways in the search for solutions. However, this does not necessarily mean that economic theory could always deliver the solutions needed, and is often also regarded as part of the problem. Among other things, this webinar pays attention to the relationship between the economy and climate change. For example, the extent to which warmer temperatures and sea level rise impact nations' economies, and controversy, how economic growth may lead to further global warming. Other questions receiving attention are what can be done with economic policies and instruments to avoid global warming or its impacts, and how global frameworks such as the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals may help in curbing the climate crisis. There is an increasingly agreed view that humanity consumes more natural resources than the planet could reproduce. Methods to account for natural capital therefore have recently received more attention. The key question is how we could assess nature's contribution to national economy and vice versa, the natural economy's contribution to the generation of nature. This webinar is intended to trigger the discussion around the thematic question if and how economic thinking could help in finding answers for the current climate crisis. I'm joined today by a few experts in this field. With me today are Professor Hans Opschoor, Professor Emeritus of the Environmental Economics and Economics of Sustainable Development in the Netherlands. Then we have Rita Plura-Paiti, researcher of the World Research Institute of Indonesia, and Wenky Ariado, PhD candidate for the International Program of Environment, Development and Sustainability at the Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. I will introduce our speakers in a little bit more detail in a minute. I will first start to give you a little bit of a structure about this webinar. We will start with a short introduction, after which we will listen to two presentations, one by Hans and one by Rita, which take approximately 10 minutes. During the presentations and also afterwards, my colleague Wenky, as well as people who are watching online right now, can pose questions, and we will try to discuss them during the presentations as well as afterwards. After the two presentations, we will still have about 30 minutes to further delve into the topics and spark a certain kind of debate. If people have an interest in receiving the slides that are shown in this webinar, in the chat there is an email address where you can send a message to receive the slides, and there's also more information in the description of the video. To start with our fellow speakers, Hans, I will start with you. I have some very interesting information about you. I see that you were part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that 2 weeks ago you were also protesting for a better climate as part of Grandparents for the Climate. Can you tell a little bit more about yourself?
Well, both things that you noticed are correct. I'm a grandfather, let me start with that, and I have 5 grandchildren, and they want me to march in favor of environmental policies and environmental change for the good. That means less warming and a cooler climate than we would otherwise get. To do that professionally, I have been researching climate change and the economics of that for a very long time. Actually, I started doing environmental research even before the so-called report to the Club of Rome in 1972 came out. I was starting my research in 71. So I'm a very old grandfather, you might say. And later on, I joined the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to look particularly at what happened in what they call Working Group 3, which is the area where mitigation is studied and what to do about mitigation and how we can engage in adaptation against climate change. So the job was to write up what research has taught us or could teach us if we listened. Not everybody is ready to listen to the climate change research, as you probably know, but many people and an increasing number of people also in the policy domain are taking into account what the IPCC is coming out with. The most recent report they did, I was not involved in, but is about ice and glaciers and so on and so forth, adding even more to the concern that we may have already felt about sea level rise. So much for, oh yeah, I should perhaps also say that I have worked and lived in Southern Africa, in Botswana, for a number of years where I did research, and I also researched without living there in India and China.
I see, so you probably have also experienced some climate change effects over there. But more later in your presentation. Thank you for introducing yourself. I will now move on to Rita. We will not see her on the screen because she's unfortunately a little bit sick, but she has still good audio connection with us. I heard you are a researcher at the World Research Institute in Indonesia, where you focus on natural capital accounting, and you also work with Partnership for Forests. Rita, can you explain a little bit more about yourself and what you're doing?
Hi, Peter. Thank you for introducing a bit about myself. Yes, currently working with WRI, but my focus of the research is now on the application of the natural capital accounting, but more specifically on the non-timber forest products, because currently we don't have the existing account on the non-timber forest product, and we see that as one of the potentials to develop in the future to complement the forest account as well. And with my previous work at Partnerships for Forests, we're channeling grants from the UK government to build the sustainable business, focusing on the forest communities and building the business models to improve the economic livelihood of the forest communities as well.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very interesting. I have some more questions for you about that later. So the third guest that we have today is Wenky. He's a PhD candidate in the International Disciplinary Program of the Environment, Development and Sustainability at the Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. And currently he writes his thesis on traditional ecological knowledge of the Indonesian customary law community on climate change adaptation. Wenky, can you tell a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, I'm a student, a PhD student in Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. Now I'm conducting my research for my thesis. It's about the traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous people, especially for sea nomads in Indonesia, how they adapt themselves to climate change, and also other parts about the policy and also development project that deal with the indigenous people around Indonesia. Just started, this is my first semester of my PhD.
Okay, that sounds very good. Well, thank you very much. I also have a mystery guest that is also featuring in this video, maybe a little bit, because there's a ladybug flying around in my room. So if you see that on the screen, then you know where it's from. So also nature is joining in a little bit. Now, to tell a little bit more about myself, as a young boy, I grew up in a forest, and as a young age, I already started to volunteer for the National Forest Agency. I studied international relations in Groningen, where I specialized in international security. But since when I started working as an intern at Foreign Affairs, I found out that, well, international security is not the biggest threat to life on Earth. Actually, it is climate change. So I made a career switch and started to work for the Ministry of Infrastructure and Environment, because it seems that for me, the government might be the most powerful actor to make a change in the current climate crisis. Last year, I worked for a year at the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Policy, where I worked for the climate envoy. And with him, I went to COP24, where I also got involved in the youth-led climate partnership. Furthermore, I was the youngest delegate over there. So for me, it was a very interesting meeting of all these smart people, all these scientists, all these world leaders, and to see how they are going to tackle the problems of today on climate. I worked there with much pleasure for a year, and currently I'm back at the Ministry of Infrastructure, and it's now called differently Infrastructure and Water Management, where I work on an international environmental vision, where we focus on better policing of current environmental norms, as well as creating an ever better living environment. And in my free time, I'm just like Mr. Opscore, I'm also protesting for the climate, and this is one of my signs that I was carrying around me 2 weeks ago when we had a big climate protest in the Netherlands. So with the introduction done, I would like to start with the presentation. And we will start with our first presentation by Hans Opscore. Hans, you can start now.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. And keep raising your voice on behalf of the elephants. I like that very much. Climate change, as you said, Peter, is one of the most urgent, and some would say the most urgent global issue at this moment. It leads to damage to crops, sea level rise, health effects, migration, more frequent hurricanes and tornadoes, and what have you. A whole list of issues that we need to come to terms with. Let me try to get a slide on for you that shows this. Oh, here I should be, yeah. This is a picture taken after a typhoon in the Philippines about a year ago. As I said, climate change is going to raise the frequency of these events. And the question is, can and should societies do something about that? And what are the economics of that? Damages are great now.
I think you're showing wrong picture.
We do not see the slides yet.
We don't see the slide yet?
Yes.
How is that?
Maybe you share a wrong application. Stop that first. Stop sharing that one and try.
Stop sharing this one?
Yeah.
Okay, can I just... Should I open another one then?
Yeah, I can help you. I can stop sharing this one for you.
Oh, yeah. Oh, there we go. Yeah.
And you can start sharing again your slides.
All right. Yeah. Are you getting something now?
Yes, and then put it on full screen probably.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sec.
In slideshow.
Is it? Can you see it now? It's on full screen here.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Excellent.
Okay. Okay.
This one.
But then we go back to the one on typhoon. Here you see the damage done by one particular typhoon about a year ago, and the question is, how much damage do we see here? What can be done about it? Who is going to pick up the bill for that? How can we make sure that those who suffer are compensated and helped to get on with their lives? And these are all economic issues. Climate change is partly due to human action, mostly. Economy is one of the main driving forces behind climate change. And I think my main point will be we need to curb as well as harness economic forces to address the climate change issue fundamentally. And that's not easy, it's difficult. And also it makes it a relevant issue in the discussions about development. Climate change results from a number of factors in the economy. Income, gross domestic product, energy intensity of income, the intensity of energy, and these factors are taken together to explain what happens in terms of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions that leads to change is the result of two factors, not only energy use that you see here, but also land use change. Land use change accounts for about 20%. So these are the issues we have to deal with in addressing climate change. Reducing emissions is called mitigation. That will happen when energy intensity is reduced, or by changing greenhouse gas intensities, for instance, by looking at the carbon content and pushing that down, or shifting to renewable energy sources, which is, I think, the more fundamental one of these two. What we need, I think, is an energy transition, particularly in the countries that have developed the energy sector already over the decades before us, if not centuries before us. And in emerging economies and developing economies, they need to shift as much as possible and as quickly as possible to a cleaner energy path, thereby sort of leapfrogging away from what went wrong in the industrialized countries of this planet. All of this calls for a change in values, a change in institutions, and a change in economic structures, and that makes it rather difficult. Much analysis looks at the factors in the equation above, population, GDP, etc., energy use, but we need to go one level down into the issues of values that are involved in economic development and growth, the institutions, the mechanisms, I'll get back to that later, and the structures. Young people must be aware of all these interrelationships. It's complex, but necessary that they get involved in this and understand what's going on, so that they will be able to pull the right handles once they come into the economy, push the right buttons, or like Greta Thunberg, this Swedish girl, 16-year-old girl, did in New York at the Action Conference, addressing political and business leaders and barking up those trees, which was, I think, the right thing to do. Some of the mechanisms that explain how economic growth and economic production lead to climate change are listed here in this sheet. I can't go into details of all these 5 elements mentioned here, but please look them up, Google them, or go to textbooks. The main thing is that what happens is that when we decide about the consumption and production, we tend very often to shift costs on to others, ecological and social costs. Pollution, the implications in terms of health, etc., are shifted on to people who are not part of the decision-making about economic production and consumption with climate repercussions, and we need to change that. We need to incorporate in decision-making the effects of our behavior on others. We need to incorporate particularly future costs and benefits. They tend to be sort of ignored due to a mechanism called time preference and discounting. I cannot explain, but please, if you are interested, Google these terms and you will find plenty of explanation, and how they lead, if we ignore all these factors, to ecological debts to future generations and our own children and grandchildren. Now, we know from economic calculations that if we make ourselves sufficiently aware of these future effects, benefits, and costs, if we do that, curbing greenhouse gas emissions to avoid warming would globally avoid damages to a level, to a value 5 to 20 times higher than the global costs of mitigation. So the lesson here is that in the long run, dealing with the results of market failures and other failures will pay off. Now, what does economics suggest as means to tackle climate change? The first lesson, I think, is that mitigating climate change by reducing emissions ultimately is the most promising kind of adaptation. Meanwhile, though, climate change will continue to a certain extent, and in that period, we need to adapt to what comes over us in terms of warming. The problem is that the countries that should mitigate are the countries where the sources of greenhouse gases are, but the victims are living typically elsewhere. Most of the sources are in the north, not all. Some developing countries have huge sources of greenhouse gases, but most of the potential victims live in other places. So climate change, as someone once said, is perhaps the largest externality ever. It is a global issue and requires international cooperation. It needs a political economic approach, I would say. Economic growth phenomena. We need to look at market forces from monopolizing decision-making on climate-related issues. We need to change the mandates and empower organizations to deal with decision makers when they decide about climate change relevant production and consumption. We need to mobilize economic agents to work sustainably and climate friendly, both in adaptation and in mitigation. Economic forces working towards inclusive, sustainable and climate neutral development. This is important in the area of mitigation, but even more so perhaps in the area of adaptation. That is what people in developing countries will have to do over the next decades when they see temperatures rising, because doing anything now will eventually only lead to lower levels of warming as a matter of decades. So for the short run future, adaptation is the thing to be concerned with. Dam building, repairing houses like in the slide I showed you, repairing water systems, replanting trees, etc. The main thing is to go for enhancing what is called resilience, the capacity, the capability of communities to handle whatever comes to them by way of climate change. Economic activities at the local level need to be developed that are inclusive, that generate incomes, that preserve livelihoods, and therefore are climate smart. I cannot give details. I show you in this slide one example, the penetration of solar energy in rural China as an example of what this all is likely to mean. But on the internet, you will find plenty of other examples. My final slide I can only introduce without dealing with it. These are policy instruments on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side. In the margins, you will find a whole list of policy instruments that governments can use to influence the economy, aimed at what you see in the center of this slide, developing climate smart development, develop capacities to innovate and to enforce climate objectives, etc. But the ways to do it, the handles to use, are on the left and on the right-hand side, changing subsidy schemes, CO2 taxation, information and training, etc., etc. So I think, Peter, to wrap up, we need, again, to make sure that we not only and make them work for us by developing inclusive, sustainable, and climate neutral production and consumption. Thank you. That was my introduction.
Well, thank you very much, Hans. This is a very interesting story. So my question to you to kick this off is, what as an individual should I do if I want to do something practical for the environment? What is like the top 3 things that I could do, in your opinion, on the basis of your story, to really make an impact?
Well, one of them you already mentioned, and I refer to that as barking up the right trees, making noise about that you want, as a representative, as an ambassador, you might say, of future generations, that you want things to be done differently on this planet. The second thing is what you can do yourself about these things, is be very much aware of climate effects and other environmental implications of your own behavior as a citizen, as a consumer, and see what you can change there. That, I think, must be said and must be done. The problem with it is, though, that the effects are very often so minute, so little, that you start worrying about the implications. Is it going to make a difference or not? Well, as long as people in large numbers show that their values include having a better future for themselves and for their children, by changing their economic activities, their consumption levels, etc., then they can make a voice together, influencing the market influencing through their consumption patterns, production patterns, and that is what counts.
Very
These are two things.
Yes.
Let me leave it at those two things.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Wenky, do you have any questions that you want to ask Hans at this point in time?
Yeah. Okay, thank you for your presentation. It's very great and it's very clear for me. One thing that I'm curious about is you mentioned about we have to encourage the local communities to become a part of the circular economy and climate change. Do you have any idea how could we encourage the local community of rural development into the term of the climate change with their own needs and their own action?
Well, in the first place, I think we need to make sure that people at the local level are aware of what is going to happen in the longer run. In the short run, they already are faced with problems, as my first slide showed, locally, for instance, through sea level rise or tornadoes or what have you. Or in many other countries, crop reductions as a consequence of drier and warmer climate situations. So be aware of what is happening and how that might develop most likely. That is one thing. But the main thing to drive changes in productive and consumptive behavior at the local level would, I think, entail making it economically interesting to go in those directions, to make sure that let's say the negative consequences of polluting behavior or energy wasteful behavior show up in terms of prices and costs that they have to bear, and the benefits of doing the right thing in terms of emission levels, etc., show up in terms of revenues coming their way. I have one example maybe from Indonesia, actually. It was in my lengthier slideshow, but I did not have time to go into that again. Do I have to share again? I wanted to go back to my slideshow, but somehow... Oh, there we are. Here is a picture of Indonesian subsidy schemes and their changes in 2015. Here you see how on the left-hand side of the slide, more than 200 trillion rupees have been taken away from the subsidies to the energy sector, and they were shifted to the right-hand side of the scales here, where they went into regional transfers to villages, where they went into ministry programs to boost growth and reduce poverty, and where they went into state-owned enterprises largely for infrastructural development. So what you see here is a shift in expenditure, stopping doing subsidies to the energy sector, the fossil fuel sector in this case, of course, and moving that towards sustainable development. Poverty reduction and transfers to villages. I think that is one way to go. Governments are very often short of cash, but if they stopped subsidizing the wrong activities, then they might have more money to subsidize more heavily the right types of activities. And that is one way of getting public means, public finance from the national level down to the regions, the provinces, the islands, the localities, the communities, at the lowest possible level, to make sure that there is enough finance to make it attractive to engage in these activities. For instance, engage in renewable energy production, engage in waste recycling, etc., etc. Does that help you, Anki?
Yeah, I agree with your opinion, because now I'm doing with my research about local knowledge and how the local communities have to contribute to tackle the climate change. Yes, the problem is because all of the budget of the funding they provide to government is just in the national levels, and then it's not delivered as well to the local communities. One thing that I'm interested in how to embrace the local community to use their own knowledge to fulfill themselves to answer all of the climate change problems, because they have their own knowledge to manage everything about the economy, support all of the needs.
I think that when you look at one particular sector, agriculture,
Yeah.
very often the local communities are very aware of,
Yeah.
of the repercussions of what they do in terms of environmental implications,
Agree.
the ecological costs and benefits. They know these things. They may
Yeah.
not be aware of new developments in agricultural research when it comes to developing new crops, for instance. There they might need to be given some assistance, given some training, etc., etc. So it's the mixture, I think, of tapping local knowledge, locally available ecological knowledge and information, and linking that with more recent developments in the universities and the research centers of, for instance, Indonesia, but also China, India, etc.
Thank you very much. Interesting answer. I think it's now to take time consideration a good idea to go to the presentation of Rita and then continue further discussion after her presentation. Does that sound good to everybody?
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, Rita, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Peter. Now I should share my screen. Hold on. Can everyone see this slide?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think before running through the presentation, I'd like to give you a bit of overview of what natural capital accounting is for the audience that may not know what it is before. So in the last decades, there's a vast amount of research that have been focused on the importance of ecosystems for people. And the natural capital accounting examines how the contributions of ecosystems to people. And there are also several methods for valuation that has been developed to count the natural resources. And one of them is the system of the environmental economic accounting, or SEEA. And in that system, in the SEEA, the ecosystem is seen as an asset that provides services or ecosystem services to people. And this asset can be counted by using the physical unit, for example, like how many bamboos are standing in the forest, in tons or in sticks or in the physical units. And it also can be counted in the monetary units, for instance, like how much worth of the bamboos in the forest, like for example, 300 USD per ton of bamboos. I'm just making these numbers up. So the next question is, why is it important to put values on the nature? First, we do have the national accounts that measure the national economic performance. However, it only captures the contribution of our economic activities without taking into account the like how much natural resource left that do we have in the nature. And with the natural capital accounting, we want to include this value of the ecosystems into the calculation of the national economy, meaning that we want to measure how our economy affects the sustainability of our ecosystem, as well as the contribution of our ecosystem to the economy. And the second thing is, it's also to indicate the nature's contribution, for example, in the sector of forestry, marine or fisheries to the national economy. Just let's say if we want to understand the economic benefits derived from the forest, we need to understand the elements that create forest and what resources are in the forest, such as the non-timber or the timber products standing there. And this also helps us to understand that forest values are more than what we currently measured. Like further, it's also will be a tool that is useful for our decision making, whether it's beneficial for the forest areas to be conserved or to be converted into areas of other use. So now we are moving on to the application of the natural capital accounting in Indonesia. The column that is highlighted in yellow the current existing account that has been applied in Indonesia. And since 1997, the Indonesia's Central Bureau of Statistics, or BPS, we called it, they have been adopting the system of environmental economic accounting to measure and to incorporate the values of natural resources to the national accounts. And the highlighted in the box with no dash, the timber resources and mineral and energy resources, it's already been integrated into the environment economic accounts. And also we already integrated to measure the green GDP of Indonesia as well. But there are also other sectors that have not been explored yet, such as the aquatic resources or other biological resources, for example, the non-timber forest products that we currently work on at WRI. Because there are also challenges remain. For example, if we want to move forward to create accounts or to value the natural resources, we the key challenges that we have is, first, we also have the problems in the data. For example, there's a loophole on the physical unit of the datasets that we have currently. For example, there are non-timber forest products that is counted in the tons, liters, sticks, or other units. That's make it incomparable to put it into one account. And also there is still different metrics used. For example, to count the prices, like the data that we already have is using the farm gate price, the retail price, and it's also not comparable if you want to make that into one account. So like this sort of the picture of what's been happening in Indonesia in terms of our progress in creating the account. But also there's also other challenges, for example, on the technicalities to build assumptions. For example, to measure the additions of stocks or the additions of the natural resources over time, because we want to know the changes of, for example, the changes of bamboo between year 1 and year 2. We currently have the difficulties in making the assumptions of the natural regeneration of each products that we have in the nature. And also, it's also still difficult to make the assumptions for the reductions in stocks. For example, how much or how many bamboos are lost, or how many bamboos are depleted in the forest as well. And the last thing is the institutional variety of needs and interests. Like on the ground, when we want to collect the data among the ministries or among the government institutions, we still find different interests on the data that they collected. For example, other ministry, they collect only certain commodities, whereas the other commodities also count that commodities, but in different value or in different units. So there is a mismatch between those two, and it's still very hard to validate which one is valid. Now, this is the last slide that I want to share on how youth can contribute to this issue. First, for individual, there is a platform created by WRI called Urun Data. It means that, like in Indonesia, urun means contribute, so contributing to the data, like crowdsourcing public data into one platform. But currently, it's only for the land extent. We have not yet expanded to other type of data sets or other ecosystems. But I think for other groups of researchers or data enthusiasts also can create more discussions to spread the awareness of this topic through brown bag discussion probably, or through podcast sharing, because I think youths nowadays are more like familiar with the podcast and listening to the like YouTube, for example, as well. So I think that's all from me. I hope that gives you a little bit of the introduction.
Thank you very much for your story. I will go to Wenky now to ask the first question on this second presentation.
Right. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Rida, for your interesting presentation. I think it's a new term for me. I just know what is natural capital accounting, especially Indonesia case. You present well for a GRAB or SEEA. And one thing that I'm curious is because you mentioned also about the challenges of this concept of the natural capital accounting in Indonesia. The first one is data concern, technical challenges, and the last one is institutional variety of needs and interest. I have a question about the last challenges that you mentioned. How could we encourage like a young researcher or a people to give a part or to take account into to solve or to answer all of the challenges on the last part?
Well, I think that's a bit high level issue that well, I don't know honestly the answer for that because that's quite a bit on the like institutional level that probably the young researchers like us don't have a link to enter to that issue and break the silo between them.
Or do you have any cases in Indonesia, during your work with this program? It's like a conflict of interest or political ecology that we have to deal with that.
Well, I think like by creating discussions and so we do have like one seminar like inviting the like Central Bureau of Statistics to share what our ideas about expanding the scope of the SEEA in Indonesia as well, and that's also part of, I think that's also part of the contribution that young researchers can help or tap into the institutional level. But I'm not sure whether this can be effective or not, because probably I don't know the political reason behind it or the motivation behind it. That's quite a difficult question.
Yeah. Thank you.
So maybe Hans can also add into the discussion. We now move into like the discussion phase of this webinar. We have about 15 minutes left. So to kick off this discussion, I researched on the internet that there is such a thing as Earth Overshoot Day, where they calculate how many resources a country uses to sustain its economy on a yearly basis, and how much percentage that is of how much resources are actually available for this country. And they kind of like want to indicate this by a date. So for example, for the Netherlands, we have already used up all the available resources for the Netherlands on the 12th of May, while Indonesia is doing much better by being the most efficient country in May of using of resources by only using up the available resources at the 18th of December. So they almost make it to the end of the year. So how can we be more efficient at our resources, and therefore also by putting a tag on the worth of resources, like the real value, not just the market value, to actually make people more aware of what we consume and probably also make better use of them. Can I first go to Hans to this question?
Well, yeah, I'll try to respond to it, Peter. In the first place, I'd like to say that this mechanism itself, Overshoot Day, is a communicative instrument that is used a lot and to convince people of the urgency of the issues. When they take the time to really look at that and see how from year to year that date shifts towards the beginning of the year rather than towards the end, it should make people worried quite a bit about the long-term consequences. It is an extension of the analysis of the ecological footprint, where for countries, but also for individuals, for people, it is calculated to what extent they put a burden onto the earth and to what extent they have reserves to manage that. And what you see is that the footprint is getting larger and deeper all the time, making, I think, conveying the message that we are actually overusing our planet to the extent that maybe now collectively we need 2 or 3 planets to make sure that we would be able to sustain our lifestyle. The fact that we are overshooting means that we are actually over-consuming natural capital. So as an economist, I would say what we need to do is what Rita is working with, putting better values onto natural resources to make sure that the damages, the loss, what I call the ecological debt in my presentation, becomes manifest and is expressed in rupees or in guilders or in euros or in dollars, so that people understand what is at stake. And that, I think, is an important thing to do, to communicate the severity of the problem, and hence to get more action going. Is that a response to what you wanted to
Yes, thank you very much. Maybe Rita can respond to this one. How we can probably make people more aware of the actual cost of the resources and of the products that we consume. I mean, of course, you have the app to collect your data, but maybe it should also be some kind of label on every product that you buy that says, well, the actual value and the actual impact of this project on the environment and the cost that come with it is actually this, instead of like the price tag that the economy puts on it. Rita?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Peter. Well, I think this is what's currently been applied at our office in WRI Indonesia. We already counted our footprints, but like the sustainability teams, they're counting our emissions from transportations. Let's say there are 20 people using cars every day, or 30 people are using the subway train every day to go to the office. And I think that's also part of the raising awareness, because after we know how much we emitted, then we can make decision whether we are doing right or we should be doing more rightful things or not. So there's one good example. When we have field trip together with our office members, at first we wanted to go to the other cities, which is far away from our based office. But when we counted the emissions, if we are going to fly there, and versus if we are just going around at our based office, it's I think the number is like 70% less emissions than our first plan. So I think by taking into account like our decisions and by putting into account our implications to the environment, for example, in this case, it's just like the greenhouse gases emissions that we emit every day. I think we step by step adapt to our more environmentally conscious lifestyle, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. Wenky, do you have something to add on that one? Hello, Wenky.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, could you repeat the question again?
I asked you if you have like anything to add on the explanation that Rita just gave. Maybe you have some questions of your own.
All right. I still have a question to hand. Could I?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Hence, if we talk about economy, it should be with good governance as well, right? We know that there is one term that we call it as a PPP, public-private partnership. How do you think is it can work as a term to transfer the climate economy into the local or rural development? How do you think about it?
Lanky, I know two meanings of PPP. The first one is the polluter pays principle, and the second one is public-private partnerships. Now, I assume you mean the latter, public-private partnership.
Public-private partnership.
Yeah, I thought so. I would have something to say on both, but I'll also then zoom in on public-private partnerships. Actually, this notion has come up some almost 20 years ago now, when we had the conference in Johannesburg, South Africa, about sustainable development. I think the then United Nations Secretary General understood that states, governments, may not be powerful enough to really handle the economy in its environmental implications. So what was needed was to work with the private sector, public-private partnerships. Later on, NGOs got included into that. So now you have private, meaning not only the private sector, the market economy, but also NGOs, non-governmental organizations. On the environment, on human rights, etc., etc., etc. That sounds interesting, and it is a way to go, but we haven't gone very far down that road yet. I think the first experiences are that what happens in reality on the ground is that those public-private partnerships too often becomes ways of channeling public funds to private enterprise, and not necessarily to the extent that environmental costs are fully borne by these companies. So it doesn't really always help as much as was hoped for. One mechanism that you might also want to look at in this connection is these round tables about palm oil, for instance, and other similar mechanisms. A lot of bringing together the expertise and the ingenuity of governments, private sector, and NGOs. Do they result in much livelihood for the great apes in Indonesia being secured? I'm not so sure. So the effectiveness of these things so far, I think, is less than was hoped for when the idea was launched some 18 or 20 years ago in Johannesburg. And in my country, the Netherlands, I think many people are critical of those PPPs in terms of their effectiveness. And the question becomes, can we make them work better from an environmental climate perspective? And that is not an easy question, but it's something that many people also in the NGO world work on, and also in government work on. But I think we haven't really found the miracle key to open that door sufficiently yet. Maybe Peter has something to say about that, because he knows from government very much about PPP.
Well, from the government point of view, it's always a little bit difficult. On the one hand, we want to work with the people. On the other hand, is of course the government is does what politics wants, and politics is represented by the people. But on the same time, you have also people in the street that protest and want again something different. So government is in between the activists in the street on the one hand, and maybe industry, and on the other hand, the people that voted and are represented in parliament. And sometimes those people are actually different people. Like lately, I spoke to a lady who was a climate activist, but she never went voting. So because she didn't trust our current political parties with the great issue at hand. So do we as a government have then also a responsibility to represent them as well? Is the question. Do we have to listen to the people in the street more? Or do we only team up with what the people want by the basis of the government? That is the question that we deal with now. And to what extent do we kind of cooperate with people? For example, when we were drafting up our climate agreement, we at many stages had people from the private sector join us. For example, nature organizations, from industry. We also try to have as many young people as possible to also give input on the development. But in the end, it's still a political thing. The outcomes of those are still debated in politics. Yes, public and private should work together, but it's always a little bit of a challenge. So I hope this answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, sorry to have put you on the spot, Peter. You're the moderator.
No, it's very good to ask me some questions too on this issue. So since we only have like a few minutes left, I think it's maybe interesting to all of us kind of like give one or two examples of things that we do ourselves on the basis of this topic to improve the quality of life on this earth and to help battle the climate crisis that we're in right now. So we can maybe inspire the people that are watching to kind of think like, oh, that's maybe a good example of things that I could do myself as well. To give an example for myself, one thing is that I stopped flying for already 5 years in a row and tried to travel everywhere by train to kind of like in that way limit my CO2 footprint. But at the same time, that is more of a mitigation tactic. Well, actually, I also try to have some positive impact on the environment. For example, last weekend I was looking into buying a piece of forest to actually have a positive CO2 footprint. And I think most models that we are looking at right now is trying to limit the amount of negative impact that we have on the environment, also by lots of industrial developments. But maybe it's also good to kind of look at how can we humans actually have a positive impact by protecting more nature areas or starting initiatives to actively support better ecology and biodiversity. What do the other speakers think of these actions? What to do this and do themselves?
Well, may I react to what you said? I think it's very important to consider mobility, our flight behavior, or the shift to trains and bicycles. Let's not forget the bicycle, by the way. These are very significant ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There's another area that I think is important also from the land use perspective, the second driver technically of climate change, and that is considering your diet. Looking at meat consumption in particular, particularly in countries such as the Netherlands, I think we must be aware that eating meat has implications in terms of the land claim involved. All fodder has to be grown somewhere, and most of it is not grown on the farm where the animal is living, as long as it lives, but is grown elsewhere and imported in whatever form into the cattle sector or the pig sector or the chicken sector or whatever in the consuming countries. And reducing your meat consumption is one way of reducing your land footprint very significantly. I'm not arguing that everybody must become a vegetarian, but everyone should and could consider the amount of meat it wants to consume, and perhaps consider also the ecological costs associated with your pound of flesh.
Thank you very much.
And in the positive domain, I think you mentioned interesting things like buying a forest or a part of a forest.
Part of the forest,
What some people can do who have gardens or little pieces of land, and talking about my own country again, because you wanted personal examples,
yes.
Making life for the insects more bearable than it is now nearby in Holland is an important way of helping to keep intact biodiversity. We have been hearing, I don't know whether Wenki and other people in Southeast Asia have heard about this, but we have a problem with insects these days. In some of the richer countries, they vanish. They used to be bountiful and plenty, and they're gone, or they're going. So I think doing something about that is something that everybody who has a little piece of land or even a balcony can do.
So planting lots of flowers, not just to make the world look more pretty, but also actually helping the insects live more easily. I mean, it's a big problem, and definitely.
And you know how important insects are ecologically and in agriculture. You're not only helping the insects, but you're also helping yourself.
Indeed as well. Wenki, you have something to add from your own experience as well, next to helping the insects.
What insects? Yeah, one thing that I want to add about these webinars, because we talk about the climate, economic, and development in the big picture, but we also need to consider of the local ability support themselves and to fulfill all of the climate crisis and all the problem about the environment by their ability as well. Just it. So we can work from the both sides, from the up and also from the bottom. We embrace both of them.
Yes, and then we meet in the middle. That sounds like a very, very good idea. So Rita?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Hans, for explaining on the meat consumption, because I've been vegetarian as well. Not really vegetarian, but I still consume seafood. So it's pescatarian. Yeah, I've been pescatarian for 3 years. Then I stopped for 1 year. Then I continued again to be vegetarian. Yeah, perhaps you have a question why I stopped for a year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but that's the reason I became vegetarian is also the first one is because I believe that like the cattle ranch, it's also part of the causes of deforestation that's been happening as well. So by reducing the meat intake, at least we can reduce the amount of the methane gas releasing to the atmosphere. And also the second thing that I've been applied to my daily life is that I'm doing the minimalism lifestyle. So I stopped buying new clothes and I start to like buying from the charity shops or from the charity shops or from the secondhand shop that is still good and reusable. And also I make sure that everything that I bought is like has missions on it. So for example, like the bag that I use now, they claim it that it's recycled from 11 plastic bottles. So I think by really applying this to our like wearable device or to our like lifestyle as well, it's also minor contribution to protecting the earth as well.
Thank you very much. And on that note, we move to the end of this webinar. So to kind of summarize, if you want to do something yourself, it's very important to buy sustainable products. Consider becoming a vegetarian. Think about your transport. Planting some trees wherever you can to support the insects and all the ecosystems, and also your crops that are in need of them to sustain themselves and to sustain our food. Moreover, if you have some money to spare, maybe buying a piece of land to protect it for future generations, because the forest and the animals don't have a voice, but you have, and you have also the money to protect them. So in that way you can help. And important of all, from a government perspective is also go vote. Vote for parties that have green initiatives that support ideas of protecting nature, to curbing CO2 emissions, and producing waste that otherwise would end up in the environment. Think about that, because voting is one of the easiest ways to also have an impact in the world. And so we can get from a top-down and a bottom-up approach a good movement to change change the world to a better place. So this is the last webinar in this series, and we hope that maybe next year there will be a new series released. But for now, this is the last one. I would like to thank our speakers, Rita, Wenky, and Hans, for their contributions and interesting discussions. Moreover, I would like to thank the organizers, Yanti Kushumato and Sharif Riyadi, for helping organizing and setting up this webinar. Thank you for watching, and remind you that you can all do something to make this world a cleaner, greener, and more livable place for all its inhabitants. And as we are all climate diplomats. We all can make a little bit of a change that way by speaking out and by taking action. Thank you very much for watching, and have a very nice day. Bye.
Bye.